and today we will analyze the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. All of you need to know that we cannot prove that Jesus Christ resurrected. No, of course not, because this is a religious idea, a religious made by theology, by what has been revealed by God, or what we believe that God revealed. It is not something that comes from reason and analyzing the world, unlike philosophy, metaphysics, and all of that. The existence of God, for example, is something that is purely metaphysical, is purely about reason. The Bible has nothing to do with that. Okay? However, the resurrection of Christ is very different. The resurrection of Christ is a miracle claim that we have made for over 200 2000 years, that this man, this Jewish man, he resurrected and that he was God in the flesh. So first we have to look the historical facts that the majority of scholars agree on. We have to know what happened historically before we can say if he resurrected or not. So first, let us look at the history. There you have it. The first fact is the idea that Christ existed, that he was a real human man, and he died by crucifixion. And we have many reports of his existence, like Tacitus, where it says the following. Tacitus fasted the guilt the Emperor Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of prosecutors, Pontius Pilatus. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. So, from Tacitus, we can know that Jesus Christ, he existed and he died, and a superstition arose after his death. Mainly the idea that he was God or that he resurrected, whatever. But Christianity started to begin. Okay? We also have the writings of Josephus, which says the following. Pilatus had condemned him to the cross. Those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold. These and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him and the tribe of the Christians, so named from him, are not extinct on this day. Now, the writings of Josephus, many claim that it had been distorted, okay, because Josephus was a Jew, an Orthodox Jew that rejected Christianity. So it doesn't really make sense that he says that he was prophesied. And the most probable thing that happened is that Josephus did write about Jesus, but that later scribes altered the text, modified it, in order to make it more evident or more Christian appealing. But we have reasons to believe that Josephus did actually write about Christ, but did not mention all of those things, that he was that he was prophesied, that he resurrected. No, but the fact that he existed. Why do we say that? Well, because we have manuscripts of Arabic manuscripts of what Josephus wrote. So the majority agree that he probably wrote about Jesus, but not so obviously or evident, because it doesn't really make sense for someone like Josephus to say those things, that he resurrected and blah blah blah. But the most probable thing is that he wrote about him. Okay? And in my video about the existence of Jesus Christ and his crucifixion, you can go there and see all the evidence for the historical existence of Jesus Christ. Now, the second fact. The second fact is that the disciples saw him resurrected and died for what they saw. This is very important, because we do not believe, because the disciples did not die for something that they saw, but by something that they believed, but by something they saw. It is very different if a man dies for saying, well, I believe in aliens, and he dies for that belief. From that is very different compared to a man that he dies because he says that he saw an alien. and he's tortured. Everything is done to him, but he says, no, 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 I saw him, I saw an alien. Right? So in Corinthians 15, which is very interesting because this is a oral creed, and the oral creed says the following: that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, and now that he has risen on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, to the 12. After that, he appeared to me than 500 brethren at one time. This is very important because Corinthians 15 is taken to be a oral creed that precedes Paul. So the idea that Jesus Christ died and he resurrected is a very early idea, and the disciples also believed that. We also find that Luke wrote in Acts that you disowned the holy and righteous one and asked that the murderer be released to you. You killed the author of life, but God raised him from the dead. So there you have Peter and the writings of Luke confirming that the disciples did believe that he died and resurrected. And Acts 2, we find the nets. But God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death. There you have it. And Acts 10, once again, that he resurrected. Now, we also have evidence from the church fathers, like Clement, Bishop of Rome. Therefore, having received orders and complete certainty trust by the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. Polycarp, he too agreed that Jesus Christ resurrected. And this is very important because Polycarp was the disciple of John, and he conversed with many who had seen Christ. So this is why Polycarp and Clement are so important, because they are very early. They are all first century information about the disciples. They met them. And Polycarp is very important because he was even a disciple of John. And he says the same thing, that Jesus Christ resurrected. He recorded their words, what they reported about the Lord and his miracles. There you have it. And he wrote a letter to the Philippian church, speaking of the righteousness and endurance witnesses in the lives of several, including Paul himself and the other apostles. Of them he says, for they did not love the present age, but him who died for our benefit and for our sake was raised by God. This is very important because you have that the disciples, they believed that they saw Jesus Christ resurrected. They not only believe it, but they saw it. And that is very different. If a Muslim comes to me and he dies in a war saying that he believes in Allah, that that only proves that he believes a lot in Allah. That doesn't prove anything. But if he comes to me and he dies, but he's all the time saying, I saw Allah, I saw Allah, I saw him, he was here. That is a very different claim. That's a very different case, because now he's not stating something that he believes, but something that was physical, that happened. Tertullian on the death of the apostles, we also find here another church fathers also saying the same thing, that Paul was beheaded as being written in their own blood, and if a heretic wishes his confidence to rest upon a public record, the archives of the empire will speak. So there you find how Tertullian was very, very certain that Paul was beheaded in a martyr. We read in the lives of Caesars that Rome Nero was the first who was stained with his blood of the risen faith, then is Peter girt by another when he is made fast to the cross. So, as we can find, the disciples, they died, they was martyred, they suffered for something that they saw. The third fact will be the following, that Paul conversion and martyrdom. And this is very important because Paul, he was against the church. He hated them, he killed them, he always went against them. However, out of the sudden, Jesus Christ appears to him in an hallucination, in a vision, and says to him that, why you persecute me? And he convinced him that he was indeed God and that he had to follow him. So there you find that this guy, Paul, did an 180. He went from going against to to supporting the early Christians, and that is very important because he was completely against them. It is like if I were to take, I don't know, to be a singer, and then bam, he starts being a Christian, or someone that hates imagine the most disgusting white supremacist. He hates anyone who is not an American. He's super evil, super disgusting. And then all of a sudden he has a vision, and he does a 180, and now he is I don't know, a lovely hippie where he loves everyone, and he treats everyone equally. Then you have that 180, and you will say, "Wow, that's very impressive. There must be a reason why that happened." Okay. So that is an important thing that you have to notice, and then you have to find a reason of why that happened. We also find the evidence in Clement of Rome and in Polycarp that he persecuted the church. Now, the fourth fact is that James, one of the brothers of Christ, he was skeptical about him. However, there you find he's out of his mind. Uh, there you have it. That initially he did not believe in Jesus. He thought he was a joke, that he was crazy. But then he became a church leader, and he started supporting the church. And that is very important because at first he was skeptical. He had no reason to believe in Jesus. However, all of a sudden he does a 180 just like Paul. But James you might say that, well, he's not very strong. He might have loved his brother or whatever. But in those times, honor was something very important. If you had a brother claiming that he's God, that he's a prophet, and all of those things, you will think, well, this guy is out of his mind. This guy is crazy. He's humiliating his entire family. It will be better for him to be dead, because if you go to the Bible, for example, in Deuteronomy, there is a law that if a man is a drunkard and he doesn't obey his parents, there is even the possibility that they may kill him. So you have that in those societies, honor was something very important. So James clearly had no love for Jesus, and he didn't want to do anything with him. He did not believe him. So the fact that this guy does a 180 is a very important fact. There you find it in the Antiquities of the Jews, that he was martyred, that he was killed for his faith, and finally the empty tomb and the woman testimony. And that you find that as the gospel records is the fact that the tomb was empty, and that is very important, and that even the Saint Justin Martyr, this historian, he also records the same thing as the gospel, the idea that they stolen the body, and that is very important because it's telling you that the tomb was empty. Because if Christ he died, and then you find people saying he resurrected. What do they think they do? They skeptics. They will go to the tomb and say, hey, here's the guy, he's dead. But that did not happen. The body was not there. So what did the skeptics try to do? They try to say, well, they stole him. It's a fraud. So you find that the body was not there, and the most important thing is that those testimonies they came from women. And it's very important because in those ancient societies, the opinion of women did not matter. It was the opinion of a woman was it was one testimony of a woman had to be like the testimony of two men. Well, no, backwards. But you get the point. It was incomplete. The testimony of a man was much more valuable than the one of a woman. And that is something that you cannot forget if you are making a fraud. Okay, that is very important because it goes against the the disciples. This is the criteria of embarrassment, which is very important. So that is why this is probably to be true. The empty tomb and the women testimony, because it goes against them. Is not in favor of them. Now, let us try to explain now what happened to Jesus Christ. We will analyze the various theories for this. The first is the theory of legends. meaning that all of what happened to Jesus Christ, the idea that he was resurrected, that he was, let's say, a god, all of that, that it was a legend made much later. Like, let's say, those legends of Buddha, where Buddha, he went and he fought with demons or whatever. But those stories are made like 400 century later. Okay? So maybe what happened to Jesus Christ was something similar. Something similar. Now, this cannot be true. Why? Because the New Testament is they are very early and they are first century material. You find Mark, you find Matthew, you find Luke, John, Acts, Galatians, the writings of Paul. All of them they are first century. In Galatians is all all scholars agree that it's an authentic letter. They do not disagree there. So the sources that we have, they are very early and they are first century, and we have good reasons to believe that it was made by the disciples. Mainly that we have very long chains confirming that. And if you want to see more on that, you can see my video where I defend the traditional authorship of the Gospels. Now, the problem of this theory is not only that, but that Paul experimented a personal experience of a literal resurrected Jesus. And he sacrificed everything for what he saw, but of course this doesn't make sense if it was a legend much later. It seems that it's earlier. The same thing applies to James. The same thing applies to the disciples. They did not believe that it was a later legend, because even them they believe it. And as we already saw, the sources they're quite early and evident. And the enemies of the disciples agree that Jesus died and even claim the empty tomb was explained by the fraud. All of those things are early. And the most important thing for this legend theory is that the main problem is that the story is not appealing. Because if you are gonna make a fraud or a legend, why would you make a legend of a man that is humiliated and he died on a cross? That is embarrassing and ridiculous for both pagan and Jews. And of course, you are saying that your God, he literally died in a cross, like a criminal. It's embarrassing and it doesn't make sense in the culture of an ancient society, because both the Jews and the pagans they hated this idea. So if it was a legend, it doesn't really make sense for his start. Now, the second theory is that it was a fraud or a lie. Well, this is very problematic because all of the disciples, not even one, backed down. They were all humiliated and they died. And a martyr doesn't become, and someone doesn't become a martyr for a lie of a fraud. If you're lying, why would you do that? It doesn't really make sense. Correct? Now, Paul and James have no reason to have converted and sacrificed everything if it was just a lie. Of course, Paul was against the church and James was skeptical. He didn't want to do anything with it. So why would they convert? Now, the third is that if it was a fraud, women would not have found the empty tomb, of course, because of the criteria of embarrassment. As we already know, that women they were not taken seriously in ancient societies. So if they are gonna lie, they will say that Paul, no, not Paul, Peter, John, or someone else found the empty tomb, but not women. Now, the story itself is embarrassing for both pagans and Jewish audience. I mean, if you're gonna make a story about how your god dies, is humiliated, and he's treated like a criminal, well, that's quite a dumb story. Then you find that all sources agree that the tomb was empty, so disciples could not have lied without being discovered. Of course, you have that even those who were opposed to the disciples, they agreed that the tomb was empty. If it wasn't, then they could all show it. They could all say it. Now, you also find that disciples were poor and they visited many cities instead of having an isolated cult. Because what do you see in cults or frauds? You find that the people they are isolated, that they are put in a little country, in a little space, and they are separated from society. Okay, that is very important because if you look, for example, at Jim Jones, at what happened in Jonestown, they were completely isolated of any other country. They were completely in one place and they did not let anyone leave. And that is something very important. And that is not true for the rise of Christianity because the disciples they were visiting many cities. So if they were making a fraud or a cult, they will stay in only one place and they will then slowly start to increase in number, not going everywhere and starting in debates and all of that. That doesn't make sense if you're trying to make a fraud or a lie. Now, this doesn't explain the 500 witnesses the disciples would have been called for making the slide. That is a very important detail that is in the gospel, that they claim that they had 500 witnesses of the resurrection. Now, if this was a lie, they would have been called out, but we do not find that. So it's probably true. Now, the other theory is the idea of a hallucination, where it says that they were not lying, but that they had many hallucinations and a mass hysteria. The, that I believe that is quite a popular theory, but it has many problems. One of them is that hallucinations they are personal experience. However, we find that not all the disciples they had experiences with Jesus, and that they had 500 witnesses. Now, if they were hallucinations because they are personal, the all of the accounts they will disagree. But someone will be saying, "Oh, I saw Jesus and he was eating." Another one will say, "No, at that moment I saw Jesus, but he was dancing." And another one will say, "No, in that very moment I saw Jesus, but he was sleeping." So you find the problem is that you can't really explain the rise of Christianity if you're claiming that they are products of hallucinations and mass hysteria, because those are personal experiences with different accounts, with disagreements. And from the information that we have, we do not find that. Now, the second is the following that the disciples claimed a corporal resurrection. This is, of course, this is debatable, but it's probably true because in the gospel we find that Jesus ate and drank, and you cannot do that if you do not have a body. Now, this theory cannot explain the empty tomb. That is something that we agree. We can explain it. James had no reason to hallucinate Jesus. He wanted to get rid of him. That is true. He will not. He did not wanted Jesus to be doing what he was doing. He will be relieved for the fact that he died. He might be sad, of course. Is his brother, is a family of him, but he will not feel the need to have a hallucination where he sees him resurrected and he's claiming that he's God. That doesn't really make sense. Paul also has no reason. Of course, why would Paul have an hallucination? He doesn't want. He hates the guy. It doesn't make sense. Now, hallucinations happen to protect the psyche, not to put you in danger. That is something very important in hallucinations. That people who have hallucinations, it's to protect their psyche, to give comfort. If your wife dies, maybe you have hallucinations where you see her alive, and your psyche is doing that to protect you from the fact that she died. Your mind is trying to protect you with a lie in order that you survive. When people start to hallucinate water, food, it is because, well, they are dying of hunger and thirst. So the mind is trying to protect you. So if the disciples are gonna receive uh, hallucination, well, those hallucinations will be comforting, not hallucination that put them in danger. Because you find that Jesus appeared to them and he says, "Well, spread the gospel over all the nations, and you will torture it, you will martyr it, you will be hated by everyone, but do that." So it doesn't really make sense for a hallucination to do that because that's not how they work. Now, we also have no evidence to say that Paul was feeling guilty to have an hallucination. We just don't we do not find that. The most probable thing is that he really did not care. because that is what we find in his letters. It doesn't. There is nothing that tells us that he was feeling guilty. Now, the other important thing is that hallucinations and mass hysteria happens when people are expecting and they are excited. There was a very famous case of mass hysteria of it was here in South America. Well, people believe that the Virgin Mary she appeared in the sky, and they were all there expecting when she was going to appear in the sky, and they were all expecting, they were all motivated, and they had all of this mass hysteria. But that happened because they were there for hours, they were expecting it, they were desiring it, they wanted to see it. However, that doesn't happen with Jesus. When we find the thing with Jesus is that their disciples they did not care anymore. Because there you find in Luke that they did not believe the woman because their words seemed to them like nonsense. They were following the guy, then the guy was crucified and he died, and they just gave up. Why will they continue? They have no reason to continue. They were not expecting the guy to be resurrected to do any of that, because there you find in the gospel that the word seems to them like nonsense. So they were not expecting, they were not excited. That doesn't really make sense for a mass hysteria. Now, the one of the most interesting of those theories is the idea of cognitive dissonance, which says the following: that Jesus died, but the disciples did not want to accept the truth and they kept going. So they knew that Jesus died, but they did not want to accept the truth, and so they were willing to do all of this because, I don't know, it was more emotionally appealing, maybe. Now, the problem of this is that Jews did not expect a corporal resurrection, they only expected it at the end of times. Okay? Because if they literally saw that Jesus died, that he did not resurrected, why would they be claiming a corporal resurrection? That doesn't make sense for the Jewish mindset. They will be saying that he resurrected, that he is with the Father, but not in body, but in soul. Or that he died. Yes, he died. His body is there, but now his soul is with the Father, and he's gonna judge all the world. They could have said that. It will make more sense in their Jewish understanding. However, that is not what they preach. They preach a corporal resurrection, which is something very unique and special, given the theological background. Now, the second problem is that this theory cannot explain the empty tomb. Very simple, it cannot explain it. There are numerous failed messiah, yet there is no reason of why Jesus will be different. And that is true. We have multiple failed messiahs like Dositius, Simon, Moses of Crete, etc. We have a lot. We have a lot of them. And what we find is that when they failed, when they died, they would just give up. They will just stop. So why would Jesus be different? If Jesus was just another failed Messiah, we would expect his movement to die right there. It doesn't really make sense to continue, and that is a problem that out of those theories they cannot explain. Now, this cannot explain Paul and James' conversion because Paul was successful, he was not guilty, he had no troubled conscience, and he had no reason to do what he did. The same thing applies for James. We would also expect that at least one would reject the resurrection because imagine, out of those guys, they know that Jesus died. They all know it, but they do not want to accept it. Well, imagine that after years of being tortured, of being humiliated, of being martyred, and dying, you would expect that at least one of them would say, "Hi man, I'm tired. All of this is just a lie. I don't know. I don't want to accept it. I'm gonna accept the truth." Maybe imagine Paul, the 5 seconds before being beheaded, he would say something like, "No, no, no, all of this is false, it's false. I give up." You would expect something like that, but that did not happen. So if they all know that Jesus is dead, you would at least expect one of them to back down, but that did not happen. And all of that makes more sense under the resurrection idea than cognitive dissonance. And of course, this doesn't explain the 500 witnesses, because they would have been brought out by meeting the lie. That is true. Now, uh, why the resurrection? Why is it a good idea? And the good things about the resurrection is that it explains all the data. Okay, we also find that the gospel was spread throughout the world, just like Jesus said. It also, the message of Christianity makes a lot of sense if God exists, and that is the only problem. You only need to prove that God exists. But if you can prove it, then Christianity makes a lot of sense. It was spread all over the world. In theism, we believe that God is all good, that He loves His creation. So therefore, the message of Christianity that God dies for His creation and that He unites Himself with it, then it makes a lot of sense. Is very fitting to His benevolence and to His loving nature. We also find that the disciples, they did not have an isolated audience, but they were constantly traveling. So this cannot be a cult. It's not probable. We also find that the story is very embarrassing because it contains women testimonies, a Messiah crucified, a corporal resurrection. You have that God that God literally dies. God dies, and that is very embarrassing. So it's quite a miracle that this story worked out. And we also find the C.S. Lewis trilemma, which is very important. We says the following: that Jesus is either three things, by accepting those facts, of course. He is either three things: he's crazy, he's a fraud, or he's God. He's a fraud. We already know why it's not possible. We have already explained. And Jesus could not be crazy because he was a clearly smart and wise guy, and a crazy man doesn't work like that. So the most probable thing is that he was telling the truth, that he was God. But overall, the good thing about the resurrection is that it explains perfectly all the data. The only problem that you have is that you need to prove that God exists, and you need to prove that you do not have good reasons to accept the other theories. And as we have already saw, the other theories about the by exception of the resurrection, all of them, they have many problems. But the resurrections solves this, and it's very good because the only need you need to presume is that God exists, and that is not something hard to do because at least for me, it's very evident that He does exist.